Hi, it's Mike Baird here, making another somewhat impromptu video about church, gender, and culture. And once again, critiquing something put out by the Reverend Dr. Kevin DeYoung. Some people might know that he wrote a fairly strong, almost scathing critique of Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. I felt some of his criticisms were quite unfair, and even in a sense, belittling her experience of having been traumatized by an abusive boyfriend in the past. I thought that was grossly unfair. And Kevin DeYoung is at it again. He's written a new article about patriarchy, why patriarchy is a good thing and complementarianism should be nested in patriarchy. He's written on that at the Desiring God website. Now, I do not have a weird fixation on Kevin DeYoung, but he is one of the authors who writes on the topic of complementarianism with some frequency, and I think he offers one of the more stronger or extreme views of complementarianism that can be found in the American evangelical context. Now, complementarianism is a spectrum. There are different ways of being complementarian, and there'll be different restrictions, different exhortations, different way of interpreting scripture and applying it in complementarian circles. And Kevin DeYoung is offering one which I think potentially goes into an unhealthy direction. And I'm also concerned about its theological and biblical validity and that kind of a thing. And I wanted to engage his view somewhat critically because I know this is the sort of material that people do read, not just in America, but also in the rest of the Anglophone world, from Sydney to Amsterdam, from London to Liberia. People can be influenced by the material that is put out in the United States. And I'm concerned that this particular article, valorizing as it does patriarchy, could have a negative influence on some very impressionable men and women training for ministry, thinking about ministry, or currently involved in ministry. So Kevin DeYoung argues that complementarianism is fine by itself, but it needs to be anchored in patriarchy. That's the basic nutshell of it. To give Kevin DeYoung his due, he rejects an abusive and malicious patriarchy. He doesn't believe in a type of patriarchy that's going to result in domestic violence, sexual abuse, sexual harassment. And I think he's sincere in that claim. I think he's sincere. He does not want to see these things happen. And I have no doubt if he saw them, he would far more than likely speak against them and oppose them. But I think he's a little bit misguided or naive if he thinks that patriarchy can be truly disarmed of its more sinister aspects. And we know that because of experience. We have the receipts where you have certain types of patriarchal culture, you get certain types of behavior towards women. The other preliminary thing I should say is I actually agree with Kevin DeYoung that there are biological differences between men and women, and those biological differences express themselves in general traits and characteristics specific to men and women. If that's the case, then what's my real beef with Kevin DeYoung? Well, I've got several things I want to bring up. First of all, I think Kevin DeYoung is insufficiently Calvinistic. Now, this might seem a rather strange claim to make against a reformed minister, but if Kevin DeYoung were truly reformed, he would be aware of the doctrine of total depravity, where every vestige of our desires are tainted with sin, tainted with the vice of sin. And if you believe in total depravity, which I do as a card-carrying Calvinist, then you would know that even patriarchy can be corrupted by human depravity. Patriarchy can be infected by sin. And if you think just sticking a kind of, buyer beware bumper sticker on, or a few kind of, caveats, is going to stop the more pernicious aspects of patriarchy taking root, then you're gravely mistaken. In the same way, if you believe in total depravity, then you've got to be very aware, very concerned that sinful natures, aggression, evil, greed, lust, a lust for power, a lust for flesh, that is going to affect men in the conduct of patriarchy. And I would say patriarchy, because it involves power over others, is especially susceptible to the corruption of the human heart. And I see that Kevin DeYoung does not seem to be afraid for women in the hands of angry authoritarian men. So on that score, I would suggest some remedial lessons in Calvinism. How do you stop, or how do you safeguard the practice of patriarchy, knowing that all patriarchal men do experience total depravity? And I think patriarchy is particularly susceptible to sins of authority, power, and abuse. The second thing I want to say is I believe Kevin DeYoung's article was insufficiently biblical. In that Kevin DeYoung doesn't address the view as to whether, patriarchy, maybe it has been in some degree or other, in some way or other, ubiquitous in human culture. How do you know that's not part of the fall? Because, when I read, Genesis, when I read the Bible, I noticed that one of the consequences of the fall is that men blame women for their problems. But before that, Adam and Eve were equal. They were both image bearers of God. They were both there in the garden together. They were a complement to each other. And I also note that Jesus, he can talk about certain things, being as it was from the beginning. That's in Matthew 19. He can refer back to a time when there was equality and harmony between the sexes, which means we should be moving into post-patriarchal relationships between men and women. And that's doubly true, I think, if we consider the Lord's Prayer, for things to be on earth as it is in heaven. We should not be working to redeem or fix patriarchy, but we should be trying to transform male-female relationships into something that anticipates and reflects the new creation, where there is no patriarchy. There is only theoarchy. There is the rule of God, there is the rule of Christ, and us reigning with Christ together in the new creation. So if you go back to the original creation, the Erdzeit, if you look at the new creation, the Endzeit, there's no patriarchy there. Okay, and if we believe our ethics are shaped by the good creation and heading towards the new creation, and if we're trying to anticipate that in our own life, that's what Jesus says, as it was in the beginning, that's what you should be aspiring for now, then I don't think there's a lot of biblical support for saying that patriarchy is a good thing, unless you want to say that patriarchy is simply the least worst option in a fallen world. But that's not the view presented in Scripture. So I don't think Kevin DeYoung's view on this is particularly scriptural. The third problem I have is Kevin DeYoung moves from biology to application, and he misses everything in between. So, okay, look, let's grant, shall we, that men are biologically fit with strength and the aggression, the assertiveness that enables them to rule families. Okay, so patriarchy, some would say, and this is what Kevin DeYoung argues, is a natural consequence of male-female biology. Okay, there's three things wrong with that. Okay, first subpoint, we have what is called the deontic fallacy. Okay, that is, an is cannot create an ought. In other words, the fact that men are stronger and more naturally prone to aggression, more so than women, that only proves that men are stronger and naturally prone to aggression. It does not mean they should rule over women. Remember, note that you can't move from an is to an ought. And I would even say a lot of our ethics tries to explicitly stop men and women from doing the things that are natural, stealing, theft, sexual aggression. I mean, you can find these things in nature. I've read articles about the sexual violence that male dolphins do to female dolphins. But we don't look at dolphins and say, well, dolphins are sexually aggressive, therefore it must be okay. We don't use that because we recognize that is and ought are different concepts. And simply replicating what happens in the natural world is not always a good thing. If we went for the natural world entirely as the basis of our ethics, then we would believe in a world where might makes right. Okay, but that is explicitly not what Christian ethics are about. It's not simply going with the grain of nature where it's the right or the duty of the strong to dominate the weak. We believe the exact opposite. We believe the strong must protect and nurture the weak. Okay, that is at the essence of Christian ethics, if you ask me. The second thing I would say as a sub point here is sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex pertains to our reproductive functions and the traits that generally typify male and female behavior, but gender are the culturally specific ways that societies attempt to regulate relationships between the sexes. And I would argue that patriarchy is not natural to our biology, it's more about gender. It is biology interpreted in a socio-cultural key, okay? And what I think is wrong with de Young's argument, what he calls nature or biology, I think is the cultural way that people try to, or societies try to regulate the relationship between the sex. In other words, he's taking something from gender and reading that back into our biology. The third sub-point here is to say that if patriarchy is natural, then which patriarchy? Okay. Whose patriarchy most accords with nature? I mean, again, patriarchy is not one thing. There are different ways of being patriarchal. You've got the patriarchy of the biblical narratives where Abraham pimped out his wife to Pharaoh, which I'm pretty sure was not a good example of patriarchy. You've got the patriarchy of medieval chivalry. You've got the patriarchy of 17th century Japanese samurai Bushido codes of ethics. You've got the patriarchy of African tribes. You've got the patriarchy of Melanesian islands. Whose version of patriarchy is rooted in nature? Whose version of patriarchy is natural? Now, what I suspect Kevin de Young wants to say is that his patriarchy, the patriarchy that he experiences in an affluent, suburban, highly individualized, technologically advanced society like North Carolina, that's the patriarchy of nature. That's the patriarchy of the Bible. And this is the problem. Everybody wants nature and God on their side for all of their views. But I submit to you that Kevin de Young's view of patriarchy is an expression of his geographical, social, economic, historical, and ethnic location. What he calls patriarchy might have less to do with nature and more to do with religion in North Carolina. And that's why we've always got to be very careful with appeals to nature in moral reasoning. Now, let me be clear on this. I think nature can and does have a role in our moral reasoning, but it's not a trump card. And here's the thing. Everybody wants God on nature on their side. I have read arguments where people have said Marxism is natural. Okay, and that's true. If you're an ant colony, something like Marxism is true, but it's not true in a wolf pack. Let me tell you that much. So some people say, well, capitalism is according to nature. Feminism is according to nature. Patriarchy is according to nature. Everybody wants their view, their perspective, authorized by God and rooted in nature. And there was something I read many years ago that tipped me off about this. There's a book called The Moral Authority of Nature, edited by Lorraine Daston and Fernando Vidal. And this is what they said. Listen to this. Almost every ideology seeks to sign up nature for its cause, to bolster its shaky political credentials with nature's authority. Just because that authority can be so widely commandeered, critics imagine nature as a kind of blank screen or mirror on which the most diverse human fantasies may be projected. Paradoxically, the most obdurate authority, nature's necessity, has been joined in these accounts to the most malleable of cultural constructs, nature as anything you can make it. So there we go. You've got to be very careful using nature as the basis for your argument, because everyone's going to say that God is on nature is on their side. Okay, the fourth point. Kevin de Young, I think, posits a false dichotomy. At the very end of his argument, Kevin DeYoung ends up saying, basically, it comes down to patriarchy or anarchy. That's what he says. It's patriarchy or it's anarchy. So it basically comes down to this. Do you believe in A, patriarchy with strong fathers, caring mothers, and stable families? Or B, do you believe in anarchy with absent fathers, negligent mothers on crack, family breakdown, pets rising up against their owners, people eating their grandparents, the criminalization of nuclear families, and governments restricting procreation to 7-yearly festivals called Pon Farr, which is from Star Trek? Is that what you want? Do you want A or do you want B? Well, when you pose it that way, I mean, A does sound pretty good, but just what if, just hear me out, what if there was a third option? What if there is an option C? We can acknowledge the biological differences between men and women, even the complementarity of maleness and femaleness. And what if we interpret them as Christians through the lens of creation and new creation with a view to promoting positive and healthy relationships between the sexes? Maybe that could be a third option, just putting it out there. Now, to any of my listeners out there who are complementarian, let me just say, look, I'm egalitarian. I know you're not going to find all of this convincing. That's okay. But I just want you to know that I think there are much better models of complementarianism than what Kevin DeYoung is advocating. And I think a complementarity based on a good biblical theology of creation and new creation is going to have a better chance of being less conducive to the more sinister aspects of patriarchy. So if you're a complementarian out there, and if you want to read your complementarianism in anything, may I suggest not in the idea of patriarchy as natural, but what I think is natural is actually cultural, and what is cultural is actually my culture in North Carolina. Rather than that, maybe you could root your complementarianism in a biblical theology, where I think it has a better chance of being more commendable, being more reasonable, and being less able to go in more sinister and destructive directions. Because if you believe in total depravity, wherever you get patriarchy, you will get sinful patriarchy. If you believe in a good biblical theology, you believe that as it was originally, and so it will be in the end, that's the real basis for our anthropology, if you like. If you believe that there is a difference between sex and gender, if you believe that it's not a false dichotomy of patriarchy or anarchy, if you accept those sorts of arguments, then I think you can reject Kevin DeYoung's argument. And maybe they'll put you a little bit closer to being an egalitarian, but it also means you won't be able to adopt the type of complementarianism that is conducive for more pernicious and predatory relationship between women. That in a nutshell is pretty much what I have to say on the topic. I know I won't convince everyone, but hopefully I'm making a number of people out there think why maybe patriarchy is not a good idea. Thanks for listening. I'm Mike Baird.